Hi everyone. So in today's lecture, we are going to be looking at propagation media. So what makes a good medium for propagation? And really what I'm talking about is what makes a good thing for plants to grow in, right? Well, it should have a number of characteristics that I have listed there, right? So it should be sufficiently firm to hold either cuttings or seeds in place. It should be easy to wet and it should hold moisture, although it should also be sufficiently porous so that it doesn't hold too much moisture. That moisture can drain away and allow air to penetrate pore spaces, right? It's important that our roots get oxygen. It should be free from pests and weeds, and it should have good nutrient levels, right? Sufficient nutrient levels to provide for our plant's growth and development, but not too excessive that it could harm or damage our plants. So when we are thinking about growing mediums for plants, I think naturally we all instinctively think about soil, right? It's what we've grown plants in for generations. It's what if we are planting in a field, if we are gardening, we are planting in soil, right? So I think it behooves us to know what soil is and then the qualities of soil that make it good for plant growth. All right, so soil is essentially disintegrated rock particles that have been modified by air and water and plants, combined with dead organic matter and living organisms such as bacteria, actinomycetes, fungi, invertebrates, and others. Right, so it's rock particles and living organisms and dead organic matter all combined, and that's what makes up soil. Now, if we're talking about soil in regards to quality for plant growth, there are two important components. First is soil texture, and second is soil organic matter. So soil texture ultimately is determining the water holding capacity of our soil. And by texture, I am talking about the percentages of clay, silt, and sand that makes up our soils. So our soil could be any sort of combination of those three things. And why it's important is because those different particles are different sizes. So the largest particles are sand, that you see up here, whereas the smallest particles are clay. Now, particle size is going to affect pore space. So if you have very big, particles that we see up here, you're going to see that there's going to be very big pore spaces in between them. Whereas if you go to our clay, where there's very, very tiny particles, they have much smaller pore spaces between them. What this means is that the bigger the pore space, the easier it is, or the more likely water is going to drain through your soil quickly. Right? So if you have a very sandy soil, it's going to have a low water holding capacity. It's going to drain water pretty fast. Whereas if you go to the opposite spectrum and you have a very clayey soil, it's going to hold a lot of water, often too much water, right? It can hold too much water. And the thing is, these pore spaces get filled up with water, but they also get filled up with air and oxygen. So if we're holding too much water, that water is filling up all those pore spaces. There won't be any room for oxygen, and we'll start to have an anaerobic environment where there is no oxygen, and that's not good for our plants either, at least for most of our plants. So for most agricultural soils, you want something kind of in the middle, which we refer to as a loamy soil, right? That has kind of equal percentages of all these, that allows for some water holding capacity, but enough drainage that doesn't get waterlogged, right? So if we go back to this slide where we're looking at what makes a good medium for propagation, we'll see that soil texture really influences a lot of these things, right? It's going to influence how firm your medium is. It's going to influence whether it holds moisture or how much that water drains away. And then it can also influence nutrient levels, particularly if you talk about a very sandy soil, maybe like what you have where you live, if you're living down in South Jersey. As that water drains through, it could also leach out nutrients. So that could be an issue that you have as well. So soil texture can affect a lot of these factors that are important for determining what makes a good propagation medium. The other really main important component in soil is soil organic matter. This is critically important. So Soil organic matter is the fraction of the soil that consists of plant or animal tissue in various stages of breakdown. We refer to that as decomposition. Now, most of our productive agricultural soils have between 3 and 6% of organic matter. And this is that material is typically found on the surface of our soil. It's in our topsoil. In the article that you're reading this week, it's going to talk about the loss of topsoil and how that is affecting agriculture and should affect agriculture in the future. It's really a critical issue that we are facing. So, why soil organic matter is so important is because it provides a number of benefits. So I have some of them listed right there, right? It improves our water holding capacity of the soil. It increases infiltration. It can also increase aeration depending on the soil, right? It's going to essentially, it stabilizes the soil. The organisms, they improve the pore spaces. So that's how we're seeing this better infiltration and aeration. It can help buffer the soil against changes in pH, and we'll learn a little bit later the importance of pH. It increases the biodiversity of soil organisms, and this in turn can help suppress diseases and pests that you may find in an area. And it also importantly, increases the nutrient availability to plants. So provides a number of benefits. What exactly is it? Right? So soil organic matter is composed of 3 main components: the living, the dead, and the very dead. So the living is all of these soil microbes and invertebrates that exist in our soil, right? It's bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, earthworms, insects, anything living in our soil. And this typically it makes up about 15% of what we refer to as our soil organic matter. And really, this is a great quote, is in just 1 teaspoon of agricultural soil, there can be 100 million to 1 billion bacteria, 6 to 9 feet of fungal strands put end to end, several thousand flagellates and amoeba, 1 to several hundred psyllates, hundreds of nematodes, up to 100 tiny soil insects, and 5 or more earthworms. So just in a teaspoon, think of how small a teaspoon is. There are billions of organisms living in that teaspoon of soil. Something I don't think many people realize. Right, so the importance of all these organisms is they break down organic material, right? And in this process, they release nutrients that are bound up in that organic material back into the soil, and those nutrients can then be used by plants for their growth and development. They also improve soil structure, right? The pore spaces between our soil, which is going to help with aeration and water filtration. And they act to suppress diseases and other pests. So very, very important. So that's one component of our soil organic matter, the living. The next is the dead. This is the detritus. This is the fresh residue, the fresh organic matter that has just died, that's recently added to the soil. And this is the stuff that all those living things are eating, right? Now, when it's added, most of it decays to carbon dioxide, right? It gets eaten by these organisms, and they release carbon dioxide in this process. And this happens typically within a few months to years, right? All of this gets broken down. And in the process, as I talked about this, it provides energy for these organisms, and then it releases nutrients both for them and plants, if we were planting there, that can be taken up by the plants. And lastly, we have the very dead, and this is referred to as humus. So humus is the stable fraction of the soil organic matter that is formed from decomposition of plant and animal tissue. So it's this final product of decomposition, right? We had organic matter, something dies, we have plant residue, it starts getting broken down by all these organisms. Eventually, initially, some of that gets released as carbon dioxide, some of these nutrients get released into the soil, and plants can take them up. This process goes on and on. Around 1,000 years later, you get a humus particle, right? And now it's this stable soil component. Now, it's typically about 70% of the soil organic matter in soils, right? So The living component is about 15%. Then you have the detritus, which is another about 15%. And then you have most of your soil organic matter is this humus. And it's important because for a number of reasons, right? So it enhances the ability of our soils to hold on to particular nutrients. That's referred to as cation exchange capacity. So cations are positively charged nutrients. Many of these are important for our plants, right? They require calcium, magnesium, potassium. If you have a lot of humus, it has good cation exchange capacity, so it's going to be able to hold on to these nutrients and protect them from being leached out, right? So in this essence, it's going to have nutrients that our plants are going to be able to uptake, right? It's going to allow for these nutrients to remain in the soil that our plants can then take up. This humus also improves water holding capacity. It helps with the soil structure. So it's a very, very important component, as the other parts are, of soils. And again, we go back to what makes a good medium for propagation. If we're looking at our criteria, we see that soil organic matter is going to influence all of these, right? It's going to influence the texture of our soil. It's going to influence its ability to hold moisture, to aerate, right? To allow for moisture to drain through, for allow air to penetrate. It's going to affect the pests and weeds in our soil. It may not keep them free from pests and weeds, but it could greatly diminish that. And it's going to greatly impact our nutrient levels. So it's a very, very important component of our soils. And in the next lecture, when we look at some more practical stuff, I will go into methods that people are using to improve or maintain their soil organic matter. So that basically covers our soils. And that is, like I said, if we are growing in a garden, if we are doing more farming or production agriculture, which we don't really touch on too much in this course. Right? But if you're doing that, if you're gardening, you have to pay attention to your soil. But if you are growing indoors, if you are practicing horticulture, right? Most of using a greenhouse, most commercial horticulture uses a soilless media, right? They don't use soil. Now, soilless media is a mix of organic material, usually peat moss or bark or coir, which is like coconut fiber, and a mineral component, which typically is vermiculite or perlite, and I'll go into what these are. And then to that, we can add a fertilizer or nutrient amendment, as well as some biologic agents. So at school, when we are there, we often use this ProMix that you see there, and that is a soilless media. It is a mix of moss and vermiculite and perlite. And then to it, it is added a biofungicide that is going to prevent funguses or fungi from growing, not funguses, fungi from growing. And it has mycorrhizae, which is a fungus itself. They are fungi that I've talked about them previously. They form a relationship with plant roots, and it helps these plants access better nutrients or more nutrients from the soil or their growing medium. So that's examples of biologic agents that could be added to a soilless media or a soilless mix. Now, the benefits of using this. Number one, they are sterile, right? So they're not going to contain any potential harmful bacteria or fungi or pests or weeds that you may find in your typical soils outside. And second, another benefit is that they are lighter, right? You fill up a pot of soilless mix is much lighter than a pot of soil. They typically, because of the components that they have, they allow for better aeration and often better water holding capacity. So they're in many ways a superior medium in which to grow plants, and it's why they are used so widely in commercial horticulture. So let's break down the actual components, right? I said there's an organic component, and then there is a mineral component, and then some additions, potentially some additions, right? So the organic component, it is often a type of peat or moss. Ideally, the best is a sphagnum moss, which you will find out in the pine barrens in wetland environments, right? This is a moss that grows in bogs, right? It's an acid-loving plant, and it's the dehydrated residue or living portions of it that we are using, right? That we take out and then we mix it in to create this medium. And it's most desirable for horticulture because it's pathogen free, it's lightweight, it has a great water holding capacity. You can hold about 10 to 20 times its weight in water, and it does contain a small amount of minerals that our plants could use, although if you're going to grow your plants long term, you'll have to require additional nutrients. Downside is it's expensive. And as a side note, if you are ever in the Pine Barrens and you somehow get a burn on yourself or a cut, sphagnum moss is a good bandage because of those same characteristics, right? It's pathogen free and it has a high water holding capacity, so it's a good bandage to use if you are cut or burned and you don't have access to anything else. Just FYI. Okay, that's sphagnum moss. That's like your ideal that you would like to use. You can also use peat moss, which isn't in that genus sphagnum, but it's similar, right? It's the remains of aquatic marsh or swamp vegetation. It has a high water holding capacity, contains small amounts of nitrogen, which are important for our plants. And this is often the main ingredient in propagation and greenhouse mixes, right? The sphagnum moss is like the specialized, a little more expensive. Your regular old peat moss is used most frequently. You can also use processed bark from different species: redwoods, cedars, firs, pines, hemlock, oaks, and maples. It's cheaper, so it's become more popular. And the bark is aged 2 to 12 months to eliminate chemicals that could be toxic to young plants. In plant science, we talk about some of these phenols, resins, terpenes, tannins, often used for plant defense. So you have to eliminate those before you're going to incorporate this into a mix. And then we also have coir, which is a coconut fiber, and this has become popular. It's becoming more popular. It's a much more economical, right? It's cheaper than peat. We use this in habitat restoration, which I do. We have these big coconut fiber logs that we use to help prevent erosion in marshes and things like that. But here it's being used as a component of a soilless mix. And again, if you go online, you can find all different varieties of these types of mixes. So that's an organic component of our soilless mix, and it's often paired with some sort of mineral component. And commonly, it's either vermiculite or perlite or both. So vermiculite is a silicate mineral. Crude vermiculite consists of these thin layers of material, and there's water trapped between them. And then they heat it up. And when they heat it up, that water turns to steam and expands, and it creates like this little accordion-like shape that you see here, right? You could see all the layers. So vermiculite is really good because it's very light and it has a great water holding ability. It's like a little sponge, right? So it's going to help your soils or your soilless mix retain water. It also contains some trace amounts of minerals such as ammonium or potassium, calcium, and magnesium that are necessary for plant growth. Right, so you're typically adding vermiculite to increase the mix's water holding capacity. Perlite is another mineral component. It will hold water like vermiculite, but it's more used to help increase your aeration of your soilless mix, right? So perlite is volcanic in origin. It's mined from lava flows. Just like with vermiculite, you heat it up, and when you heat it up, it pops and it kind of pops like popcorn. If you ever look in a soilless mix and you see what looks like little bits of styrofoam, that is your perlite, right? So it'll hold water like vermiculite, but it's better, it's more useful for increasing aeration. It does not contain any mineral nutrition. You may also see, although rarely, less commonly, pumice can be added. Again, this is used to increase aeration. It's a little bit heavier than perlite. Perlite is very, very light. And then in a soilless mix, you will also see rock wool. And this is typically, you will just see rock wool as opposed to it being combined with any other component. And this is used commonly in hydroponic germination. So you will germinate your seeds in rock wool and then transfer them over to any sort of system that you have. We'll actually be doing this later on in this course. So rock wool consists of various rock sources that are kind of melted together. And then as it's cooled down, it gets spun into fibers and pressed into these blocks that you see here. And it holds water, but it also, while it holds water, it also allows for good oxygen levels, right? And it doesn't decompose. So you will, if you are going to plant in here, we're going to do it in this course, but you will plant seeds in these individual little rock wool blocks, and they'll germinate. And once they start germinating, you will move them into your hydroponic system. So another component that you will see in a soilless mix, typically rock wool you will see as its own, like I talked about. I don't know if I've seen it in a mix included, but maybe. So that's our mineral component. Then, like I said, we typically add some sort of supplement. So most commonly, we are adding limestone, and this is to increase the pH of our soilless mix. So that peat, right, is often grown in, you'll find that in acidic bogs or acidic marshes, right? So it's a more acidic plant, and it's gonna has a low pH. The tissues of that peat have a low pH level. So by adding limestone, we're going to increase the pH of our soilless mix to something that's appropriate for plants to grow in, which is somewhere between a pH level of about 6.2 to 6.8 is ideal. You can also add other fertilizer supplements. Gypsum is added sometimes as a source of calcium. If you are going a little more organic, you could add worm castings, which are essentially worm poop that's high in nutrients, and we'll talk about that in the next lecture. You can add compost. You could add other fertilizers, either organic fertilizers that get mixed in, or you can add slow release synthetic fertilizers, which we'll also talk about as well. But those are essentially the components of a soilless mix. Now, I talked a little bit just there about fertilizers, right? Fertilizer supplements. And these are important because our plants require nutrients to grow and develop. So there are 17 essential elements that our plants need for their growth and development and functioning. 3 of them are carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, right? And our plants are going to get them from the air and water, right? And that comprises greater than 90% of the dry weight of our plants. So most of what our plants need, they obtain from the air and the water. And they are getting these elements through the process of photosynthesis, right? So that is where our plants are taking in carbon dioxide and water and using energy, light energy, to create glucose, a sugar molecule, and oxygen. Now that glucose gets stored as food or can get converted into hundreds of other compounds through all these different metabolic pathways, or it can get broken down via cellular respiration to create energy. And cellular respiration is the process by which plant cells, animal cells, break down glucose to create energy that's going to power all cellular activities. So why photosynthesis is important, besides it's the way that our plants are making food, is that it is directly responsible for the yield and quality of vegetables, right? If you have reduced photosynthesis, you'll have reduced dry weight of your plants and you'll have reduced yield. And this reduced photosynthesis can occur whether it's due to shade, right, cloudy weather, or weed competition, or disease that affects the leaf area, or nutrient deficiency or predation, or drought. Right? All of these things can affect photosynthesis and ultimately affect your yield. So besides those 3 elements, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, your plants also need 14 mineral nutrients. Right? And these are nutrients that they get from the soil or that we've added to them if it's a soilless mix. Right? And they are broken down into macronutrients and micronutrients. And your macronutrients are used in the largest amounts. And within our macronutrients, we have them further broken down into, where's my pointer? Into primary nutrients and secondary nutrients, with primary obviously needing the most, secondary needing less. So we have macronutrients used in the largest amounts, and then micronutrients, which are used in smaller amounts. Now, just because they're used in smaller amounts doesn't mean that they're not important, right? Our plants need all of these nutrients in order to grow and develop properly. We just refer to these as primary macronutrients because they need the most of them, right? The largest quantity. And really, if we were looking at our macronutrients, the three big ones are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. In pretty much any fertilizer that you're going to see, they always have the NPK numbers, and that is referring to these three primary macronutrients. But like I said, these other ones are important as well. We just typically, our plants don't need them as much as they need these three ones right here. So a couple things about our mineral elements. They can have interacting effects, right? So potassium uptake can be enhanced by adding calcium to the soil. So we can have a positive interaction sometimes. But we can also have a negative interaction. If we look at calcium and magnesium, they are antagonistic. So an excess of one could lead to a deficiency in the other. So it's things to be mindful of in a fertilizer program. Another important aspect of our mineral elements is that some are mobile and some are not. So mobile elements can translocate from one area of a plant to another, right? So they can move within the plant to areas that they are needed. And this is important, as we're going to see in the next lecture, when we're trying to diagnose nutrient deficiencies, right? So if we are dealing with mobile elements, those deficiencies will show up on the lower leaves and tissues, which is the older leaves and tissues. Right, and how this works is, say we have a deficiency of nitrogen, right? It's a mobile element. So our plant is growing and it's using nitrogen to grow and develop, and eventually there's not enough nitrogen in the soil, right? So as it's developing new leaves up here, it needs nitrogen to develop those leaves. So, and there's no nitrogen in the soil. So what it can do, it can take that nitrogen from the older leaves and translocate it up to the new leaves. So as a result, those new leaves will grow and they'll have nitrogen and they'll look like normal leaves. But where they have taken the nitrogen from, those older leaves, which are on the lower part of the plant, will start to show deficiencies. So that is so we have mobile elements, right? But if we have an immobile element, such as iron, those deficiencies are going to show on those top leaves, the newer leaves, right? Because our plant is growing, it had enough iron when it developed its first leaves, and now it's going to grow some more leaves, but there's no more iron in the soil. It can't take that iron from those leaves because it's immobile, right, from the lower leaves. So the top leaves are going to show that deficiency. So element mobility, like I said, it's an important tool when we're trying to diagnose nutrient deficiencies. It'll help us out, kind of narrow down what element may be missing. And then lastly, we are going to look at soil pH. Another important component of our soil or soilless mix that can affect plant growth and development. So pH is the measure of acidity or alkalinity of a soil, right? So a measure of hydrogen ions or hydronium ions. And essentially, the more hydrogen ions you have, the more acidic your soil is, and that's a lower on the pH. So a pH of 7 is neutral. Below 7, as you get below 7, it's more acidic. Above 7, it's more alkaline. So plants will vary, depending on the plant species, will vary in their optimum pH levels and the range of tolerance of different pH levels, right? The majority of our vegetable crops have a pH range or a target pH range of about 6.2 to 6.8. So that's like the sweet spot where they will grow well. And why pH is so important is because it affects nutrient availability and then also affects nutrient-related toxicity. So if you see in this next graph that we have here, or figure, you'll see that soil pH will affect the availability of plant nutrients for plants, right? So it's going to directly affect the nutrients that our plants can take up. So for certain nutrients, such as iron, manganese, boron, copper, and zinc, they are more available in the soil for our plant to uptake when there is a lower pH level. Whereas for potassium and sulfur, or molybdenum, however you say that, they are going to be more freely uptaken when it's a little bit more basic. But if you look into what we refer to as like the ideal, right, from ideal pH for our plants, right around here from like 6 to 7, you see that is at that level you have good availability of pretty much all of your nutrients that your plants needs, right? So it affects nutrient availability, but it can also lead to nutrient toxicity when you start to get some extreme pH levels, right? So if you're talking about plants that are grown in acidic soils, they can start to exhibit aluminum, hydrogen, or manganese toxicity, right? So again, as well as calcium and magnesium deficiency. So again, if you look over here at calcium and magnesium, at these low pHs, these elements aren't readily available to be taken up by plants. So if you get an extremely low pH, you can see hydrogen ions will damage the root cell membranes, right? So that would be our hydrogen toxicity. Aluminum is present in most soils, but it's not water soluble until the pH is below 5.2, right? So once you get below 5.2, aluminum becomes water soluble. It can be taken up by plants. And when it does, it can interfere with calcium uptake and the production of ATP and DNA, right? And you start to see signs of aluminum toxicity. And manganese toxicity, manganese solubility increases just like when we talk about aluminum as pH drops. When a pH gets below 5.6, it could lead to toxicity, and that signs of that include crinkling or cupping of leaves. Now, the factors that lower pH in a soil or make it more acidic, one is rainfall. Right, rainfall itself is slightly acidic. It has typically about a pH of 5.7. But also, when it flows through soil, it leaches out basic cations. And cations essentially are positively charged ions that increase pH. And those are sodium, calcium, magnesium, potassium. So as rainwater is flowing through the soil, it's going to leach out sodium and calcium and magnesium. And as it does this, it leaves behind more hydrogen ions and aluminum ions that in turn make your soil more acidic, lower the pH. And as I kind of talked about in the beginning, your soil texture will affect that leaching. So if you have a very sandy soil, that water is going to leach through very quickly, and as a result, your sandy soils are typically more acidic. Now, other factors that can affect or lower pH, make it more acidic, are root respiration or the respiration of microorganisms because they are releasing carbon dioxide, and that increases carbonic acid in our soil. Plant growth can lower pH. Your plants will absorb nutrient ions. And most of these nutrient ions that they are absorbing are these cations, these positively charged ions that we talked about. And as a result, to maintain a neutral charge in their roots, so they are absorbing these cations and they're going to release hydrogen ions, which are also positively charged. And that we said, right, what increases acidity is the positively charged or is hydrogen ions, right? Go back to here, right? The amount of hydrogen ions in our soil makes it more acidic. Fertilizer use can also lower pH. So ammonium fertilizers can react in the soil to form nitrate and release hydrogen ions in the process. So all these things can lower our soil pH, make it more acidic. There are also factors that could raise pH, make it more basic. Those cations, right, will raise the pH. And those are increased through weathering of the parent rock that have those elements in it, right? So if you are just in an area where your underlying bedrock has been broken down and it has these ions within it, you're going to have a bit more basic soil. And the accumulation of alkalinity in a soil also occurs when there is insufficient water flowing through the soil. That is not going to be able to leach out soluble salts. So if you have a situation where there's not enough water leaching through your soil, it could lead to a buildup of these positive cations. And we can see that in arid conditions or where there's poor soil drainage. We don't have sufficiently, these cations are not leached sufficiently through, and we have a buildup or more alkaline soil. But that is the rarity, right, in general. And I don't have the thing here, but in general, the reds here are your more acidic soils, whereas your blues are your more basic soils, and the yellows are kind of in between. So if you kind of see, most of the time, at least where we're found, we have a slightly more acidic soil. But if you look again, where your basic soils are would be regions where are more arid, like in the Middle East here, Northern Africa, etc. So that's that. This was to highlight some aspects of propagation media, some aspects of soil that are important, what makes up a soilless media. And from here, in our next lecture, we're going to apply practical aspects to it, right? So we'll talk about how to improve soil organic matter if we are in a garden or if we were doing larger farming, production agriculture. We will talk about different recipes for soilless mixes if you're interested in that. And we'll go through aspects of fertilizer and composting and the like. So I hope you guys are doing well, and I will see you with the next lecture.